On this play, Lidstrom circles his own net with his head up and sees Hall planted against the boards near center ice, where Hall observes the contact and makes a perfect saucer pass to Datsuk, who's building up speed, where this speed would then force the Canucks defenders to collapse into their own zone, where he gains the offensive line. He draws in 3 defenders and dishes it off to a now wide open Steve Yzerman, where Yzerman with his head up is able to fake a shot pass several times, forcing the defenders into having to choose between attacking him or covering the passing or shot lanes. And at this point, he has now drawn 4 of the 5 Canucks defenders into collapsing onto their own net. And I have no clue as to when Yzerman had the chance to survey his ice, see if there's any trailers open. Maybe it was drawn up, but Yzerman then proceeds to put it on his backhand and does a no-look pass right on the tape of Lidstrom, where
Stevie spins out, Lidstrom shot, score!
this play doesn't even scratch the surface of Yzerman's Hall of Fame career, as it was a masterclass of using his hockey IQ and puck skills to single-handedly break down the opposing defense, leaving Detroit with a high danger scoring chance. Because with 1,755 points, 3 Stanley Cups, a Selke for being the best defensive forward of the year and a playoff MVP, Steve Yzerman is without a doubt one of the greatest players of all time. But here's the thing, what made him so special as a player was his hockey IQ, as he played in an era where smaller frame players were rare, meaning that smaller players being the top players of the game were almost non-existent. Not only did he dominate offensively, but for a long stretch there, he was a top defensive player in the game. So factor in his world-class leadership, him ending up in a management role was inevitable. So it then begs the question, would his knowledge of the game translate into him being a top GM in the league? Well, unfortunately due to the cup wins in Detroit, Ken Holland wasn't going anywhere. Therefore, Yzerman would be forced to look elsewhere, where he would end up signing as the GM for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And let's put this into perspective for a moment here. Yzerman would leave Tampa in 2019 to join his hometown team in the Detroit Red Wings. Therefore, yes, Yzerman left Tampa before they made 3 Stanley Cup finals in a row, where they would claim back-to-back Stanley Cups. But let's not get it twisted. Yzerman may not have his names on those cups, but this Tampa run was built by Steve Yzerman. How, you ask? Drafting and developing. In 2011, he would scoop up one of the greatest players of the modern era in the 2nd round, Nikita Kucherov. Are you joking me?
He's in! Score! In on hope, he fakes, scores! He did it again!
2012, he would trade Kyle Quincy for a 1st-round pick, then proceed to draft one of the greatest goalies of all time in Andre Vasilevsky.
And it's knocked down right back to him, a save by Vasilevsky. Behind him, he had it in his glove.
He has made some fabulous saves so many different ways.
In 2014, he would trade up in the draft to last minute, where he would select Braden Point.
Gets in, Point is in, scores!
He would then trade Jonathan Drouin while his value was still high and pick up Mikhail Sergachev.
Corner, in front, Sergachev scores! 2 shorthanded goals.
He would draft one of the most underrated two-way centermen in the league in Anthony Cirelli.
Lightning really handed it to him, and it was the physical play that turned it.
Steal by Cirelli, gets the feedback, cuts in a lob, scores!
So many home run picks that it would lead Tampa to a near dynasty. Not to mention that he would develop guys like Stamkos and Hedman to a T, putting them into a position where they're Hall of Fame locks. Yes, his trades and signings were good, but what made Yzerman so special as a GM in Tampa was his drafting and development. Now, I'll then ask you this. Drafting consistently is one of the most difficult tasks in the NHL. No, it is the most difficult task in NHL history. Because to put this into perspective, let's look into the numbers here. Also, big shout out to the hockey writers. These stats were sourced from them. But okay, when you think of a good NHL career, what comes to mind? In terms of games played, I'd probably say around 750 plus, as this doesn't mean that they were an all-star or a Hall of Famer, but it does mean at the very least that they could keep a roster spot for around 9 years without injury and 10 to 11 years with some injuries. And okay, only about 25% of first-round picks will play 750 games. In the 2nd round, this drops to 8.1%, and by the 7th round, this drops to 1.9%, meaning, and it's kind of hard to believe, but only around 2 to 3 players from each draft class will play 750 games in the NHL who were drafted in the 2nd round. But okay, let's amp it up here. I would say that in terms of forwards, if they can score 1,000 plus points, they were at one point a bona fide superstar, if not top player in the league. Hall of Famers, if not the Hall, very good. And since the inception of the NHL back in 1914, there have only been 100 players who have ever reached this milestone. And from that, only 3.8% of first round picks have scored 1,000 or more points. In the 2nd round, that drops to 0.2%, 0.5%, and from rounds 2 to 7, there is a 1.5% chance that a 1,000 point player comes out of a draft. This number is abysmal. Think about the optics here. In the last several decades, there have only been 3 players who have scored close to 50 goals who were drafted outside the first round, and the only 3 players who have a chance of surpassing 1,000 career points, which is Kaprizov, Kucherov, and Braden Point. Steve Yzerman just so happened to draft 2 of them. What are the odds? Is this man a drafting genius? Yes, you can slowly build through the draft, while at the same time getting your main advantage through trades and free agency signings. Think about Vegas or the Florida Panthers, but drafting a contending roster is hands down the best path to winning a cup. However, according to the rule of averages, you would have to assume that Yzerman drafting 2 50-goal scorers outside the first round was complete and utter luck, and without Kucherov or Point, Tampa Bay most likely doesn't win a cup, let alone win back-to-back. So it makes you think, was Yzerman's success in Tampa just a fluke, as his success in Tampa was due to his masterclass drafting, which just so happens to be the hardest thing to do in the NHL, as I've been seeing constant comments, replies across the internet, if not hundreds within my own comment sections, calling Steve Yzerman a fraud. And well, after looking into the numbers, I would discover something shocking. New GM is hired. Majority of the time, he is taking over a dumpster fire of a roster situation. Because of this, it is not fair to judge a GM's vision right off the get-go. Not in year 1, not even in year 2 or 3, and depending on how bad it was, not even in year 5. And I will say, yes, Ken Holland left a long-lasting legacy in Detroit, but at the same time, he would leave a dumpster fire when he left the team. No high-end draft picks, over a decade of nothing in the draft aside from Dylan Larkin and Filip Hronek, no slam-dunk free agency signings, absolutely nothing here. But with that being said, Yzerman took over in the summer of 2019. We are heading into the 2026 season. Yet, this team still hasn't made the playoffs. Because on this graphic, we have the additions and losses since Yzerman took over the team. Most notably, we have Alex DeBrincat, Patrick Kane, JT Compher, and Andrew Kopp. However, this would also mean the loss of key players like Tyler Bertuzzi, Pius Suter, and Filip Hronek, on top of the 7th overall draft pick, which would turn into Kevin Korchinski. Also, one of the most bizarre transactions I've ever seen was giving away Jake Wallman for a second and future considerations, as the Shark would then later flip Wallman for a first-round pick to Edmonton, where he actually played a pretty big role in their cup final appearance last season. This one made no sense. Like, come on, something had to have happened behind the scenes. Honestly, wouldn't doubt if Yzerman just hates TikTok just that much. But here's the thing, looking at this graphic, I think Yzerman has done a lot more good than bad. Yes, the handling of Jake Wallman was terrible, but by no means defines his tenure. Trading away the 7th overall pick in a rebuild sounds absurd from face value. However, the odds of drafting a 34-goal scorer at that spot is very low, especially when you consider the first round of this draft was relatively weak. Therefore, I would give Yzerman a B-, in the context that in terms of building the future direction of this team, to some extent, it has hands down been counterintuitive. On one hand, I completely understand Yzerman's vision here. He's trying to build a culture by acquiring many veterans who have won Stanley Cups, as that's invaluable experience to give to a young and up-and-coming star. But at the same time, the fact that he signed so many veterans, which will ultimately take away roster spots and opportunity, while at the same time not letting them draft in the top 5, has also meant that Detroit hasn't seen a young game breaker from the draft. Again, we're talking about the big dogs here, as Raymond and Seider are great, but there's levels to this. We're talking the Barkovs, Draisaitl's, McDavids, Eichels, or even Sam Reinhart. When we look at every past Stanley Cup winner, their foundational players have carried that team to a cup. Yzerman being fixated on turning this team around as quick as possible has absolutely been a negative thing. Now, I will say it's obvious that he's trying to game the system here by acquiring a bunch of draft picks to hopefully counteract him signing so many veterans, leading to them being stuck as a mediocre team. But I don't know how else to put it. I witnessed the exact same trend as a Canucks fan. With that being said, unlike the Canucks, Yzerman has done a fantastic job at managing a salary cap. Most are locked up until age 30, making just over $8.5 million will age like fine wine. In fact, I would say it already has.
And get a jar out there.
What a hit. Hit deep. Seider.
Oh,
Scores!
The captain, Dylan Larkin, being locked up for $8.7 million is a perfect contract. Lucas Raymond is on a perfect long-term deal. The ability to somehow convince Patrick Kane to play mediocre hockey for pennies compared to his open market value is just impressive. And when he does sign those questionable veteran contracts, for the most part, he's been able to keep the term down to prevent a logjam of contracts when future players come into the league. So overall, I'd give him an A, because with the rising cap, we're talking about cap savings upwards of $15 million between just Larkin, Seider, and Raymond. Raymond. This right here is how you build that championship caliber depth. As Evan Bouchard just signed for $2 million more than Seider on a bridge deal, come on. With that being said, being great with contracts really only becomes a championship caliber edge when you draft star players. You grow them in the system, you get them to buy in the culture, and then take that deal. Because with the salary cap going up exponentially, I can't imagine many players are going to be taking a massive discount in the open market. Therefore, the only possible saving grace here, in terms of Yzerman having this grandmaster plan that will lead Detroit back to a dynasty, is drafting. Somehow repeating the success of the Tampa Bay era. Because as we mentioned, he would hit a home run with Seider and Raymond, as Mo Seider is that playoff style defenseman who can defend and score at a high level, while at the same time laying out your best player. Lucas Raymond can be that 90-point guy locked up on a bargain, but that's still not enough. So how has Yzerman done? Marco Kasper looks to be like a potential 30-goal, 60-point two-way center.
Again, across the Kasper scores! And the Red Wings have tied it again.
That's a great pick, you know, a Bo Horvat type center who can do really well in a second line matchup situation. They have their workhorse, do-it-all defenseman and Seider, and they would also draft Axel Sandin Pellikka, who has been a monster in the SHL, as he can relieve that offensive pressure off Seider and take off into being a stud offensive defenseman. Simon Edvinsson is a giant, smooth-skating two-way defenseman, a versatile piece you can play anywhere in the lineup.
Edvinsson moved up and just crunched his man. He's Edvinsson off his stick, and it's going to be a break. What a play, though, by Edvinsson. Who gets it to Simon Edvinsson. Wrist shot. Scores! Simon Edvinsson.
Sebastian Cossa being picked at number 15 was a bit questionable, and his development has been rocky, but he has shown some great glimpses and has the upside of a starter. With that being said, they also drafted Trey Augustine. Looks like a potential elite goalie here. Now I will say it's way too early to tell, but he hasn't drafted any obvious players outside the first round that could develop into a Kucherov or Point, which was his bread and butter in Tampa. But how could you expect him to? As we went over, the odds are virtually impossible. But in terms of the foundation here, he already has an elite center and some more in the system. He's drafted and developed some good scoring wingers for depth. Carter Bear this past draft looks like the real deal and a potential steal at pick number 13.
Carter Bear completes the Hattie!
He's already drafted a legitimate top-pairing defenseman with Axel Sandin Pellikka being the next potential Lane Hudson. He has drafted two good goalies who could turn into starters, meaning the man has drafted in every position. But again, we're still missing those upper echelon type players. Sandin Pellikka could be that guy, but offensive defenseman development can be very hit or miss. So overall, I'd give Yzerman an A-. But again, way too early to tell here, but he's done well. But I think the best path to success for this team will be Yzerman continuing to develop and draft these players into good, maybe not the upper echelon type players, but finding good depth and locking them into team-friendly deals, to the extent where he can build a very deep roster. Because if we take at the goal differential of the Red Wings, from the time he took over up until this last season, we have seen great progression, as he went from a minus 122 from the tire fire he would inherit from Ken Holland to being positive in 2024. That is a 126 goal difference in 5 years. That's huge. As clearly this team is heading into the right direction, you just have to hope that some of his big draft picks do develop into something, or they may just be stuck in mediocrity. I'd really appreciate a like on this video, and as always, thanks for watching.